Hey, it's Lou, and here's the thing. An essential feature of any democracy is the right to vote. Yet, in most countries, a big chunk of the population is prohibited from voting. I'm talking about adolescents. Obviously, a line has to be drawn somewhere. No one wants toddlers selecting heads of state, so the vast majority of countries set the voting age at 18. But what about younger citizens? Specifically, what about 16 and 17-year-olds, many of whom pay taxes and are treated like full-fledged adults in the military and criminal court? Are they capable of making informed electoral decisions? And come to think about it, what about old folks? If there's a minimum voting age, why isn't there a maximum one? There's no magic age delineating adolescence and adulthood. That's apparent when you consider the various thresholds set in the law, at least here in the States. Consider Mississippi, for example. Mississippians have to wait until they're 21 to buy booze, but they can drink beer, just beer, at 18 if they're in the presence of a guardian. Meanwhile, 13-year-olds can be tried as adults in a Mississippi courtroom, and the age of sexual consent is 14 in certain circumstances. But you gotta be 16 and a half to get a driver's license. There's no minimum age to own a rifle or a shotgun. So yeah, kind of all over the place with this age thing, and it's a different story in every single state and obviously in every single country. So, how did we arrive at 18 as the voting age? Well, in America, the voting age was actually 21 until the Vietnam War. To a lot of folks back then, the idea that you could be 18 years old, coerced into joining the military through the draft, sent to a foreign jungle to potentially die in a controversial war, but not be allowed to vote for or against the policymakers that sent you there, well, I mean, it does seem pretty crazy. So the slogan, old enough to fight, old enough to vote, became a rallying cry to enfranchise 18-year-olds. This became settled federal law through the 26th Amendment, which had the speediest ratification ever. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out that well. The youngest eligible Americans tend to vote at a far lower rate than the rest of the population. Political scientist Mark Franklin, a professor emeritus at Trinity College, told me 18 is probably the worst age to give someone the right to vote. He called the age range enfranchised by the 26th Amendment, 18 to 21-year-olds, a sour spot for voting. It makes sense when you think about it. 18 is the age that people are often on their own for the first time. There's no parent to encourage them to vote or drive them to the polls. Instead, they're surrounded by peers who probably aren't great civic role models. If you're living on a college campus, you might be states away from the place you're registered to vote. Not only is it a pain in the ass to get an absentee ballot, but you're disconnected from local issues. Your parents' newspapers aren't lying around the house. You don't overhear them chatting about politics at dinner. Plus, 18-year-olds have a lot of shit to do. They're likely adjusting to a new routine at college or the workforce. They move more often. They're establishing new relationships, etc. So, by and large, 18 to 21-year-olds don't take advantage of the 26th Amendment for fairly lame but pretty understandable reasons. Still, what's the harm? Even if the 26 empowers just a small number of youngsters, then it seems positive. Besides, those people who skip their first elections will vote later on in life, right? As it turns out, that's not necessarily the case because voting or not voting is a habit. And the habits we form when we're young are really tough to break. Recent research out of the EU suggests that a voter's first 2 elections are especially key in determining whether or not they'll vote over the course of their lifetime. Franklin told me to consider the women's suffrage movement. After American women got the right to vote in 1920, it took 50 years for the gender gap in U.S. turnout to be eliminated. In other words, women, unfairly disenfranchised for so long, got in the habit of not voting, and that habit was really tough to break. The gender gap only closed when new generations of women who had not formed the habit of not voting, aged through the electorate. This data implies that if young people don't vote today, that can reverberate for decades to come. You can have a lost generation that never shows up at the polls. But the thing is, while 18 to 21-year-olds are a sour spot when it comes to voting, 16 and 17-year-olds are in a sweet spot. They're likely still living at home, so maybe they're surrounded by good civic role models like parents and high school teachers who can engage them on important issues. They might be still taking civics courses or social studies classes so they can have fresh knowledge of how the government works. This isn't just theoretical. In the US, a handful of municipalities in Maryland have given 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote in local elections. In one of those towns, Tacoma Park, 16 and 17-year-olds were twice as likely to vote than citizens 18 or older. So, if good habits can be formed at 16 rather than 18, that can bode well for the future. Franklin, who is in the middle of a study on youth voting, showed me data to support this idea. He told me his preliminary findings indicate that while voting rates have declined about 15% across the world in recent decades, there is no decline, in fact, a bit of an increase among people who are permitted to vote at 16 years old. That's in places like Nicaragua, Brazil, and Austria. Again, the habit is easier to form when you're younger, and it has a tendency to stick. Austria, by the way, is a good counterexample for anyone who thinks extending the vote to 16-year-olds is just a liberal ploy to bring left-leaning politicians to power. When Austria lowered the voting age, a far-right group made major inroads in the government, but I digress. In addition to empowering young people, a study out of Denmark found that youth voting produces a trickle-up effect. That is, parents with voting-age children at home are about 4% more likely to vote themselves. Okay. So lowering the voting age brings more people to the polls, youngsters and their parents, for a long period of time. The question remains, are these 16 and 17-year-olds competent? Are they smart enough to cast a legitimate vote? Psychologist Lauren Steinberg, an adolescent expert at Temple University, told me there's two types of cognitive abilities that develop as we get older: hot cognition and cold cognition. Hot cognition comes into play when we have to make a decision while we're aroused, when we're in a social setting or there's some sort of pressure. That type of cognition doesn't fully develop until our 20s. But cold cognition skills are firmly in place by the time we're 16. These are the type of cognitive abilities we tap into when we could calmly rationalize and intellectualize things without social pressure. Voting, done in a private booth, is an activity that relies on cold cognition. Therefore, 16-year-olds, from a scientific perspective, are capable of doing it. This is a point I got into with Brandon Klugman, a campaign manager for Vote 16 USA, an organization seeking to lower the voting age. When I asked him if 16-year-olds were well-informed enough to vote, he made 2 points. First, he said if we lower the voting age, we should also create a more robust civics curriculum in schools so that students are better informed. Teachers can facilitate debate and explain the relevant issues. Second, he pointed out that eligibility criteria, things like education, civics literacy, and cognitive abilities, don't apply to voters over 18, so why should they apply to younger ones? It's an interesting point. I mean, almost 2/3 of Americans can't name the 3 branches of government, so it's not like there's a high bar when it comes to entering the electorate. Besides, if we're concerned that 16-year-olds don't have the cognitive ability or aren't informed enough to cast a vote, should we have the same concerns about the elderly who are susceptible to cognitive decline, who might not understand issues like cyber warfare and election meddling on social media? Plus, when you're older, there's less of an imperative to worry about long-term problems like climate change and the deficit. You can afford to be selfish with things like Social Security and Medicare because you won't have to pay for them. The next generation will. So perhaps it's the elderly who should be prohibited from voting. Look, I'm being a bit provocative here. I think anyone who has a stake in society has a right to vote. And that's the point. No one has more of a stake than young people. So they might be inclined to take a long view to support sustainable, forward-thinking policy. Because when you know that you're responsible for fixing something, you're a lot less likely to break it. And since evidence shows that lowering the voting age to 16 helps youngsters form good habits, why not give them a head start? Okay, I'm gonna go live my life.